You know that feeling in the pit of your stomach? The one that whispers you're not good enough, that you've messed up too badly to fix? For years, one number governed my entire life, a number I was too terrified to even look at. This isn't just a story about credit. This is a story about the lies we tell ourselves, the shame we carry, and the exact moment you realize the monster under your bed is one you created yourself. And more importantly, how you can dismantle it, piece by terrifying piece. The most dangerous lie I ever told was a simple one. It was so convincing I came to believe it myself. It wasn't uttered to a lender or a landlord. It was the lie I whispered in the quiet moments, the one that colored every significant decision for nearly a decade. It's better not to know. My moment of perfect, crystallized denial did not occur in a bank. It happened in a generic, brightly lit car dealership on a Saturday afternoon. The scent of artificial lemon and new vinyl filled the air. I was there out of necessity, not desire. My old car had succumbed to a final, terminal rattle. I had a stable job, a decent down payment saved, and had rehearsed my pitch. I was, to any outside observer, a qualified buyer. But inside, a cold void of dread had taken root. The finance manager, a man named Mark with an impeccably bland smile, tapped away at his keyboard. He asked for my social security number. I gave it, my mouth dry. The screen flickered. His smile didn't falter, but it stiffened, retreating into something professional and wary. He cleared his throat. The system is taking a moment, he said, not meeting my eye. Sometimes it gets a little slow on weekends. We both knew it wasn't the system. We were adults playing a charade. I felt a familiar, hot wave of shame crash over me. The shame of being transparent, of having my hidden failure decoded in seconds by a stranger. I stood up before he could speak again, mumbling something about needing to check with my insurance. I walked out past rows of gleaming vehicles, my retreat not a strategic withdrawal, but a full-scale rout. That was the power of the unknown number. It allowed me to frame my escape as a choice, not a consequence. I chose to leave. I wasn't rejected. See the difference? It's a fragile, pathetic alchemy, but it was the only one I had. This was not financial illiteracy. This was a sophisticated, self-constructed psychological fortress. Checking my credit score felt akin to reading a medical prognosis for a disease I feared was fatal. If I didn't look, the diagnosis wasn't real. The numbers to be a financial metric and morphed into a definitive, quantitative judgment on my character, my reliability, my very worth as a functioning adult. It was the inverse of a report card. It was a catalog of every misstep, every period of unemployment, every moment of fiscal panic fossilized into a 3-digit integer. To look would be to confront not just past decisions, but a version of myself I was actively trying to outrun. The shadow this cast was long and distorting. It shaped my life in ways both overt and insidious. I became a master of the cash economy, which sounds robust and independent, but in practice meant paying hefty deposits to turn on utilities, missing out on cashback rewards and purchase protections, and always carrying the anxiety of physical currency. I navigated romantic relationships with a landmine of omissions, changing the subject when apartments or vacations were discussed, framing my preference for keeping things simple as a philosophical choice rather than a financial blockade. Professionally, the fear was a constant, low-grade hum. I worked in an industry where security clearances and financial responsibility were sometimes peripherally checked. Every performance review, every promotion discussion was tinged with a private terror. Is this the moment they find out? I declined opportunities that involved corporate credit cards or expense accounts. I constructed a narrative of being a specialist who was best left to his core duties, not to be burdened with financial responsibilities. I was curating my own professional containment to avoid exposure. The turning point, however, arrived not with a financial ultimatum, but with an emotional one. My younger sister, brilliant and ambitious, was accepted into a graduate program. It was her dream. She sat across from me at our kitchen table, the acceptance letter between us like a shared treasure. Her eyes shone, then clouded with frustration. "The only hurdle is this one private loan," she said. "They need a cosigner. Dad's retired, and his income doesn't qualify, but yours would. Would you Could you look at it? The question hung in the air. It wasn't a bank asking. It wasn't a faceless corporation. It was the person I loved most, trusting me, seeing me as the stable, successful older brother I pretended to be. In that moment, the shadow I lived in was no longer just my own. It was stretching out to darken her future. My deliberate ignorance was no longer a victimless act of self-preservation. It was an active failure of love. The shame transformed from something personal and private into a tangible barrier I had erected against someone else's dreams. That night, in the silence of my apartment, the lie finally broke. The facade of better not to know crumbled under the weight of that simple, trusting question. I opened my laptop. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The tremors were all internal. I navigated to a major credit bureau's site, one I had visited 100 times only to close the browser tab before logging in. This time, I entered my information. I clicked Submit. The page loaded with a terrifying efficiency. There was no dramatic pause. It presented a dashboard, a series of summaries and alerts. My eyes skipped over the charts, the percentages, the offers. They went straight to the center of the screen. The number wasn't just low. It was a number that felt like a verdict, a confirmation of every silent fear. It was in the low 500s, but the number itself was almost an anticlimax. Below it was the true gut punch, a list of terms in stark bureaucratic language. Charge-off, collection, derogatory mark, serious delinquency. Each one was a blank space in a story, a chapter heading for a period of my life defined by struggle and silence. The monster had a face now. And it was a spreadsheet. The paralysis of not knowing was over. It was replaced by a new, more profound terror, the terror of finally knowing, and the sheer, monumental scale of the wreckage I now had to survey. The escape was over. The reckoning had begun. The number stared back at me. 512. It was not a surprise, yet seeing it formalized in a clean, digital font felt like a physical blow. The initial reaction was a profound numbness, a cognitive white noise where emotion should have been. My brain, trained for years in avoidance, simply refused to process the data. This lasted for perhaps 3 minutes. Then, as if a dam had burst, the narrative floodgates opened. A torrent of self-recrimination washed over me. Failure. Irresponsible. Fraud. The 3-digit integer was not a score. It was a scarlet letter branded onto my financial identity. But as the wave of panic receded, leaving a cold clarity in its wake, I made a critical decision. I would not look at this document as a verdict. I would approach it as an archaeologist, not an inmate. This credit report was not a judgment of my character. It was a fragmented, incomplete fossil record of my past survival. My task was to excavate it, to understand the context of each artifact, not merely to lament its existence. I clicked the link labeled Full Report. What unfolded was not a simple list of failures, but a stark timeline of a life punctuated by crises. Each derogatory mark was a coordinates pin on a map of my 20s and early 30s. The largest item, a charge-off on a major credit card, was not a tale of frivolous spending. It was the ghost of 2010. I was 2 years into a deeply competitive, low-paying assistant position in my field, clinging to the hope of a promotion. The culture was one of unspoken expectation. After-work drinks at upscale bars, weekend networking retreats. To admit I couldn't afford the entry fee was to admit I didn't belong. The card became a passport to perceived competence. The final, catastrophic balance wasn't for a television or a vacation. It was a tapestry of business-class hotel rooms, client dinners, and a single, desperate suit purchase to attend the funeral of a senior partner's family member, where I believed my appearance was a professional necessity. The charge-off was the administrative tombstone for my attempt to buy my way into a world I wasn't sure wanted me. Next was a collection from a regional hospital. This entry was a Binglin reminder of a single, chaotic month. My father had suffered a health scare 3 states away. I dropped everything, drove through the night, and spent weeks managing his care, liaising with doctors, and handling his household bills. In the ensuing chaos, an emergency room copay bill sent to my temporary address was misplaced, then forgotten. By the time the collection notice found me, the debt had ballooned and been sold to a third-party agency whose robotic, threatening calls felt like a violation. It wasn't negligence. It was a triage error during a family crisis. Most poignant was the default on a federal student loan. This was the crown jewel of my financial shame, and the one most shrouded in misunderstanding. I had, like millions, deferred payments during a period of graduate school and underemployment. The labyrinthine repayment portal offered a dozen plans. Overwhelmed and already feeling defeated, I selected one I believed I could manage. What I failed to comprehend was the deadly arithmetic of forbearance. Interest capitalized relentlessly, and my occasional, heartfelt partial payments were not applied to the principal, but were swallowed whole by the accruing interest. My attempt to be responsible was mathematically nullified by a system I did not understand. The default status was not a symbol of defiance, but of profound confusion and a spiraling sense of hopelessness that made ignoring the official letters easier than confronting their incomprehensible content. Sitting there, with the pale glow of the screen illuminating the dark room, the pivotal realization dawned. My credit report was not a ledger of moral failings. It was a clinical chart of unmanaged trauma. It documented periods of anxiety, familial obligation, professional insecurity, and systemic confusion. The common thread was not a lack of character, but a lack of a functional framework to navigate these pressures without financial casualty. I had responded to each crisis with the tools I had at the time: avoidance, short-term fixes, and willful ignorance. And the report was the cold, algorithmic consequence. This reframing was the first, essential crack in the prison wall. The shame began to transmute into something else, a focused, almost clinical determination. The number 5112 was not me. It was the sum total of a series of historical events and poor strategic choices. And if it was built over time through a sequence of actions and reactions, then it could, theoretically, be deconstructed through a different sequence. The monster had a name, a history, and a structure. It was no longer a formless terror. It was a problem. And problems, no matter how complex, have components that can be addressed. The journey forward would no longer be about erasing the past. That was impossible. It would be about building a new, parallel narrative so compelling and consistent that it would eventually overshadow the old fossil record. The goal shifted from fixing my credit to demonstrating a fundamental and sustained change in financial behavior. The report was no longer my enemy. It had become my blueprint. Every negative entry was a point of failure to be analyzed, and every empty line of future history was a space to inscribe a new story. The anatomy of the wreckage was complete. Now, the reconstruction could begin. Conventional wisdom, I quickly discovered, was a siren song for the desperate. It offered clean, algorithmic solutions: the debt snowball, the debt avalanche, a strict 50-30-20 budget. For someone with a score anchored in the low 500s and a history of charge-offs, these felt less like strategies and more like instructions on how to properly rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. My situation required something less orthodox, a psychological and tactical approach that addressed not just the numbers, but the foundational shame and learned helplessness that created them. I decided to stop playing a game I was guaranteed to lose and invented a new one. The first step was not financial, but emotional triage. I recognized that throwing money at a problem born from anxiety would only create more anxiety. Before I contacted a single creditor, I sought a form of financial therapy. This was not a formal arrangement, but a disciplined practice of reframing. I created a guilt-free budget spreadsheet. Its radical feature was a line item labeled peace of mind. This was a small, weekly allocation of money, sometimes as little as $20, that was expressly forbidden from being used for debt or bills. It was to be spent on something that offered tangible, immediate relief: a quality cup of coffee, a new book, a long walk in a park requiring paid parking. This served a critical neurological purpose. It began to sever the connection in my brain between money and pain. It reintroduced the concept of money as a tool for positive reinforcement, not solely a mechanism for punishment or survival. With my psychological footing somewhat secured, I turned to the report. The prevailing advice is to immediately dispute inaccuracies or to haggle with collection agencies. I chose a different, more nuanced path, the goodwill audit. My hypothesis was simple. Faceless systems respond to form letters, but human beings sometimes respond to context. I identified two negative items from original creditors, not debt buyers, that were legally accurate but contextually brutal. These were the student loan servicer and the credit card issuer from my early career days. I spent a weekend crafting two handwritten letters. They were not disputes. They contained no legal arguments. They were, instead, concise narratives of circumstance. To the student loan servicer, I outlined my genuine confusion regarding repayment plans during a period of economic hardship, acknowledging my responsibility while explaining the paralyzing effect of the complex options. To the credit card company, I briefly described the professional pressures of that specific time, not as an excuse, but as an explanation for a pattern of spending that was fundamentally misaligned with my actual income. In both, I clearly stated that I was not requesting a deletion of the accurate history, but a goodwill adjustment, a one-time revision based on my subsequent history and current commitment to resolution. I included proof of my current, stable employment and a screenshot of my new bare-bones budget. I sent them via certified mail, a cost I included in my peace of mind allocation for the month. The result was not a Hollywood moment. The credit card issuer responded with a standardized denial. But the student loan servicer's response was different. It was a single paragraph on official letterhead. They would not remove the default, but they approved me for a one-time rehabilitation program, a series of 9 manageable on-time payments that, upon completion, would remove the default status from my report, though the late payments would remain. It was a partial victory, a crack in the monolith. More importantly, it validated the strategy. Sometimes, appealing to institutional discretion is more powerful than challenging institutional facts. Simultaneously, I needed to generate positive data. The idea of a secured credit card, where you provide a cash deposit as your credit line, felt demeaning, a public admission of failure. I had to reframe it. I went to my local credit union, not a major bank, and spoke to a banker. I was transparent. My credit history is poor. I am here to rebuild it, starting from zero. I would like to open a secured card as a training tool. Her response was professional and non-judgmental. This card became my laboratory. The goal was never to utilize credit. The goal was to demonstrate impeccable, repetitive behavior to the algorithmic systems that track it. I established a ritual. On the first of the month, I would use the card for one specific budgeted necessity. Exactly 1 tank of gasoline. I would then set a calendar alert for the 3rd of the month. On that day, I would log in and pay the balance in full, well before the due date. This was not about avoiding interest. It was about creating a flawless monthly data point of low utilization and payment made early. The card was not a spending instrument. It was a behavioral telegraph, sending a signal of radical reliability every 30 days. Finally, I explored the emerging frontier of non-traditional credit data. I enrolled in a service that, for a minimal fee, verified my on-time rent and utility payments and reported them to 2 of the 3 major credit bureaus. This was a revelation. For over a decade, my largest, most consistent financial obligation, keeping a roof over my head, had been completely invisible to my credit report. Overnight, years of silent, responsible behavior were translated into positive trade lines. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about claiming credit for the present stability I had already achieved. It turned my everyday survival into a strategic asset. This phase was characterized by a quiet methodological patience. There were no dramatic score jumps. The progress was measured in the establishment of systems, the subtle shift in my own self-perception from debtor to strategist, and the gathering of tiny, irrefutable pieces of evidence that my financial profile was no longer defined by what I had done, but by what I was doing now. I was no longer reacting to my history. I was meticulously constructing my financial future, one deliberate, unconventional brick at a time. Progress, I learned, is not a linear ascent. It is a slow, tectonic grind punctuated by long periods of agonizing stillness. After the initial momentum of establishing new systems, I entered the most psychologically demanding phase of the entire journey, the plateau. My score, which had crept out of the deep 500s and into the low 600s, became stubbornly inert. For months, the graph on my monitoring service was a flat horizontal line. I was performing the rituals flawlessly. The single tank of gas, the immediate payment, the on-time rent reporting. Yet, the algorithmic overseer seemed unimpressed. This was the valley of discouragement, where the rational mind understands the theory of credit building, but the emotional mind screams that the effort is futile. The temptation to obsess was immense. I found myself checking my score weekly, then daily, seeking a validation that would not come. This was a relapse into the old pathology, seeking a number for emotional relief, and it threatened to undermine the entire endeavor. The true test was not in the action, but in the sustained faith during inaction. I had to confront a brutal truth. The credit scoring models are designed to be skeptical. They reward long-term behavioral patterns, not short-term proofs of concept. My past was a 7-year history of delinquency. A few months of good behavior were statistically insignificant noise against that signal. To continue required a philosophical shift. I was not repairing my credit for a quick reward. I was cultivating a new financial identity, and identity formation is a slow, iterative process. The goal became the behavior itself, not the score it generated. The secured card payment was no longer a tactic for points. It was a monthly covenant with my future self. During this period of stagnation, an unexpected source of reinforcement emerged. I had, out of lingering shame, avoided discussing my journey with anyone in my personal life. However, I found myself on an online forum, one not dedicated to credit hacks or loopholes, but to the sober, often painful sharing of experiences around financial recovery. The anonymity provided a safe space. I read stories from a teacher whose credit was destroyed by medical debt after a car accident, from a small business owner who had personally guaranteed a loan that failed. Their timelines were measured in years, not months. They spoke of similar plateaus. In one particularly impactful thread, a user with the handle Phoenix Again wrote, "The score will move when it decides to. Your job is to build the record so that when it looks again, it has no choice but to see something new." This was not advice. It was solidarity. It normalized the waiting. These strangers became my unintended support group, proving that the shame I felt was a common currency and that persistence was the universal solvent. Then, with no fanfare, the first major structural shift occurred. A charged-off account from over 7 years prior simply vanished from my report. There was no notification, no letter. I only noticed during one of my now weekly check-ins. The entry, which had felt like a permanent scar, was gone. Its disappearance was governed by the Fair Credit Reporting Act's statute of limitations for most negative items. This was not an achievement of my active strategy, but a testament to the relentless forward march of time, a force I had previously feared, but now learned to rely upon. The psychological impact was profound. It was tangible, physical proof that the past was not permanent. The report was not an indelible record. It was a living document, and time was an editor that gradually redacted the oldest failures. A concrete weight lifted. My score nudged upward slightly, but the emotional resonance was far greater than the numerical gain. The true breakthrough, however, arrived several months later. After successfully completing the student loan rehabilitation program, the default status was removed. Coupled with the aging off of the old charge-off and the now 2-year history of perfect payments on my secured card and rent, my score finally, decisively, crossed the threshold from poor into fair territory. The moment was conspicuously undramatic. I was in a coffee shop, working on my laptop. The alert from my credit monitoring app popped up silently in the corner of the screen. "Your score has been updated." I felt no urge to cheer. Instead, I experienced a deep, quiet sense of verification. The hypothesis had been proven correct. Consistent, strategic action, compounded by time, alters the algorithm's perception. To test this new reality, I did something symbolic. I went to the website of a reputable auto lender and used their pre-qualification tool, which involved a soft credit inquiry. Within minutes, I was presented with a list of hypothetical loan offers. The interest rates were not stellar, but they were real, and they were for amounts that could finance a reliable used car. A year prior, this same tool would have returned a blank screen or a message to contact them directly. Here was the crucial part. I did not need a car. I had no intention of taking on debt. I closed the browser tab. The power I felt in that moment was not the power to borrow. It was the power to choose not to. For the first time in my adult life, credit was an available option, not a defining limitation. I had gained the privilege of refusal. This was the real victory, not a number, but the restoration of agency. The plateau had been the necessary crucible, burning away my need for instant gratification and forging a colder, more resilient understanding of the process. The breakthrough was not the score increase itself, but the profound shift in my relationship to the entire system. I was no longer a supplicant hoping for mercy. I was a participant, finally understanding the rules well enough to play a long, patient game. The culmination of this journey was not marked by a celebration, but by a series of profound and quiet silences where anxiety used to reside. The ultimate reward was not an 800 credit score, a number I would eventually reach and then stop monitoring with any regularity. The true liberation was the dissolution of the ever-present, low-frequency dread that had hummed in the background of my life for over a decade. It was the absence of a feeling. This liberation manifested in mundane, yet extraordinary moments. It was filling out a rental application for a better apartment in a better neighborhood and handing it to the property manager with calm assurance, knowing the background check would reveal not a history of failure, but a documented trajectory of recovery. It was opening an insurance renewal statement and noting, almost as an afterthought, that my premium had decreased due to a favorable financial responsibility score. It was the ability to discuss future plans, a mortgage, a business idea, with my partner without that familiar internal flinch of shame. The score had receded into the infrastructure of my life, like the electrical wiring behind the walls, essential, powerful, but utterly invisible in its daily operation. From this crucible, a core philosophy was forged, a personal algorithm distilled from years of trial, error, and psychological negotiation. I call it the credit resilience equation. Financial behavior time, emotional shame equals credit resilience. Let us deconstruct it. Financial behavior is the active component, the deliberate, consistent actions, the secured card rituals, the negotiated rehabilitations, the reporting of rent. It is evidence. Time is the passive, non-negotiable catalyst. It is the force that allows positive behaviors to accumulate statistical weight and that gradually diminishes the impact of past negatives. It cannot be rushed, only respected. The most critical element, however, is the subtraction of emotional shame. This is the psychological work. Shame leads to avoidance, to panic-driven decisions, to the belief that one is inherently flawed. It is a toxic multiplier that poisons the other variables. Removing it, through reframing, through therapy, through community, is not a soft skill. It is the essential strategic move that allows behavior and time to operate effectively. The result is credit resilience, not a perfect static score, but the durable capacity to withstand financial setbacks, to engage with the system without fear, and to wield credit as a tool, not be defined by it as a verdict. This understanding brings with it a critical, non-negotiable caution. The system has a long and unforgiving memory. Complacency is the enemy of resilience. The habits forged in recovery must become as permanent as the vigilance once directed toward avoidance. A single misstep carries disproportionate weight. This is not a one-time fix, but a lifelong practice of stewardship. The goal shifts from achieving a number to maintaining a state of mindful financial integrity. It is a practice, like fitness, requiring consistent effort even after the desired state is reached. And so, we arrive at the heart of the matter, the message I needed to hear when I sat in that car dealership, drowning in silent shame. If you take only one thing from this story, let it be this. The number you are afraid of is a ghost. It is a data point reflecting a past version of you, a version that was likely doing its best to survive under circumstances you may not have controlled. It haunts you only as long as you grant it the power of definitive judgment. You built that prison of fear, log by log, with every avoided statement, every rationalized denial, and you alone hold the tools to dismantle it. The first and most terrifying tool is the simple, deliberate click to look. Do not look to judge yourself. Look to map your escape. Look to see the wreckage not as your identity, but as the starting coordinates for your journey out. This path is brutal. It is personal, and it is unequivocally possible. My story is but one variation on a theme of recovery. If you are ready to begin drafting your own map, to learn from the raw, unvarnished strategies of others who have dismantled their prisons in ways you may never have imagined, then you need a different kind of guide. This is where your next step begins. Subscribe to Credit Comeback Stories on YouTube. We do not trade in quick tips or empty promises. We dissect the psychology behind financial shame. We showcase the arduous plateaus and the unconventional breakthroughs. We feature real people navigating the complex algebra of their own resilience equations. We provide the community, the strategy, and the honest perspective you will not find in a standard financial blog. Click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your comeback story does not begin with a paid-off debt or a higher score. It begins the moment you decide to stop being afraid of your own financial reflection. That moment is now. We are here for the next chapter. See you there.